"Just take my hand and trust the horse," the quiet stranger said, and the most powerful CEO in Texas looked at him as though he had asked her to step into the very nightmare that had stolen her father, her courage, and 12 years of her life. The wind drifted slowly across the rolling hills of Whitmore Ridge Ranch, carrying the scent of sun-warmed cedar, fresh hay, and the faint sweetness of wild bluebonnets blooming beyond the white fences. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled beneath an endless summer sky while the rhythmic creak of an old weather vane echoed across the empty pastures. Storm stood alone inside the largest paddock, a magnificent black stallion whose glossy coat shimmered beneath the afternoon sun like polished obsidian. His ears flicked forward as he watched every movement outside the fence, powerful yet strangely patient, as though he had spent years waiting for someone who had never found the strength to return. Claire Whitmore hadn't stepped onto this ranch in over a decade. Billion-dollar boardrooms, private jets, international acquisitions, and magazine covers had become easier to face than the quiet gravel road leading back to the place she once called home. She could negotiate mergers worth billions before breakfast, but the sound of a horse breathing only 50 feet away made her chest tighten until every breath felt borrowed. She folded her arms tightly, more to steady herself than to hide the slight trembling in her hands. Her tailored cream riding jacket looked untouched by the dust surrounding her, expensive boots resting awkwardly on the same ground where she had once raced laughing beside her father as a little girl. Everything looked smaller now, except the memories. They seemed larger than the ranch itself. Across the fence stood Caleb Rowan, his worn denim shirt rolled neatly to his forearms, weathered leather gloves tucked into one back pocket. There was nothing extraordinary about him at first glance except the remarkable calm that seemed to settle wherever he stood. His blue eyes never judged, never pitted, never rushed anyone. Years of raising horses and raising a daughter alone had taught him that fear rarely disappeared because someone demanded it to. It disappeared because someone waited long enough for trust to grow. Storm slowly walked toward the fence until only a few feet separated him from Claire. She instinctively stepped backward. The movement was almost invisible, but Caleb noticed. So did the horse. Storm lowered his head instead of advancing, releasing a slow breath that fluttered a loose strand of Claire's golden hair across her cheek. She closed her eyes for only a second, but that single second carried 12 years of guilt she had never spoken aloud. Everyone believed she feared horses. The truth was far heavier. Every time she looked into Storm's dark eyes, she saw the final morning she had heard her father's laughter, the final ride they were supposed to take together, and the silent promise she had made herself that she would never climb into another saddle again. Caleb quietly opened the gate without saying another word. The hinges groaned softly beneath their own age as sunlight spilled across the narrow path between Claire and the waiting stallion. Neither man nor horse moved. Neither demanded anything. They simply waited. And for the first time since the tragedy that had quietly rewritten her entire life, Claire found herself wondering whether healing had been waiting here all along. Before the story takes a turn, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, do you think she should trust him? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's continue. Claire remained outside the open gate longer than she intended, her fingers resting lightly against the weathered wooden rail while Storm grazed quietly only a few yards away, no longer watching her with curiosity but with the peaceful confidence of an animal that had learned patience from years of waiting. Caleb never urged her forward. Instead, he reached into a nearby feed bin, scooped a handful of oats into a metal bucket, and walked toward another paddock where two younger mares lifted their heads the moment they heard his boots crossing the gravel. His movements carried no unnecessary energy, only the rhythm of someone whose days were measured by sunrise, seasons, and living things rather than calendars and quarterly reports. Claire watched him without meaning to. At the headquarters of Whitmore Industries, every minute belonged to someone else. Assistants hurried through polished hallways balancing tablets and schedules. Executives interrupted one another before meetings even began. Every conversation seemed designed to win something. Yet here, silence did not feel empty. It felt respected. A small red pickup rolled slowly toward the barn, its tires crunching softly across the limestone driveway before stopping beside the weathered porch. The driver's door flew open, and a cheerful little girl jumped onto the ground carrying a backpack nearly half her size. Her blonde ponytail bounced as she hurried toward Caleb with the unmistakable excitement only children could carry after finishing another day at school. "Dad," she called, smiling so brightly that even the horses lifted their heads. Caleb turned, and the serious expression that rarely left his face softened immediately. "How was science class?" he asked as she wrapped both arms around his waist. "I got every question right," Emma answered proudly. "Mrs. Dawson said my project about horses was the best in class." Caleb laughed quietly. "I had a feeling it would be." Emma finally noticed the unfamiliar woman standing beside the fence. She looked at Claire for several seconds without speaking, studying her expensive riding clothes with the honest curiosity only children possessed. Then she walked over with a warm smile that carried none of the hesitation adults often learned. "Hi. I am Emma." Claire smiled politely. "Hello, Emma. Are you buying a horse?" the little girl asked. Claire let out a small laugh she had not expected. "No. Actually, I am thinking about selling this ranch." Emma's smile faded only slightly before she glanced toward her father. Caleb continued filling water troughs as though he had not heard a single word. He respected conversations that belonged to other people. Emma looked back at Claire. "That would make my dad sad." Claire blinked. "Why do you think that?" "Because he loves this place," Emma answered simply. "He says some places help people remember who they are." The word settled into the afternoon air more heavily than Claire expected. She turned toward the sprawling hills beyond the pastures where old oak trees stretched across hundreds of acres her family had owned for generations. The ranch had become another asset on a balance sheet, another property waiting for legal approval, another line inside a presentation prepared by lawyers who had never watched a sunrise from this porch or listened to horses breathing beneath the stars. Selling it made perfect business sense. Keeping it made none at all. At least that was what everyone in New York kept telling her. Caleb finally walked back carrying an old leather brush. Without saying anything, he handed it toward Claire. "You do not have to ride today," he said calmly. "You do not even have to touch him if you are not ready. But every friendship has to begin somewhere." Claire stared at the brush resting in his hand. It looked worn from years of use, the wooden handle polished smooth by countless quiet mornings. It was such an ordinary object. Yet somehow accepting it felt more frightening than signing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Slowly, almost without realizing it, she reached forward and wrapped her fingers around the brush while Storm lifted his head once again, standing quietly beneath the golden afternoon light as though he already knew she had just taken the smallest and most important step of all. Claire held the old brush against her chest as though it weighed far more than weathered wood and worn bristles. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the valley, painting long shadows beneath the towering oak trees that had witnessed generations of Whitmores growing up beneath their branches. Emma wandered toward the chicken coop humming softly to herself while Caleb quietly repaired a loose section of fencing nearby, never once glancing toward Claire as if he understood that some battles could only be fought in silence. She looked at Storm again. The stallion stood peacefully beneath an ancient pecan tree, lazily swishing his tail while warm summer air stirred through his dark mane. There had been a time when that sight would have filled her with excitement instead of dread. She could still remember being 8 years old, running barefoot across these same fields with her father chasing behind her, laughing so hard he could barely catch his breath. He had always said that horses could hear a person's heartbeat long before they heard their voice. "If your heart is afraid," he would tell her with a smile, "they will protect you by keeping their distance. If your heart is honest, they will find you." Claire had believed every word. Until the day everything changed. She closed her eyes as the memory returned with painful clarity. It had been a bright October morning filled with crisp air and golden leaves drifting across the hills. She had begged her father to ride Storm before breakfast because she wanted one last ride together before leaving for boarding school the following week. Storm had still been young then, full of spirit and barely trained, but her father never refused her when she asked to spend time together. He had smiled, adjusted his hat, and promised they would take the easy trail overlooking the creek. It was supposed to be an ordinary ride. Instead, it became the final morning she ever heard his voice. The official reports called it a tragic accident caused by an unexpected medical emergency while riding. The newspapers described it with respectful headlines. The board members spoke about legacy and leadership during the funeral. But Claire never believed any of them. Deep inside she carried a different story, one she had repeated to herself every night for 12 long years. If she had never asked him to ride that morning, he would have stayed inside. If she had not insisted, he would have lived. Every promotion she earned, every company she built, every award she accepted had been constructed upon a foundation of guilt no one else could see. Miss Whitmore. Emma's gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Claire opened her eyes and found the little girl standing beside her, holding 2 glasses of fresh lemonade. Dad says it tastes better outside. Claire accepted one with a grateful smile. Thank you. Emma sat beside her on the old split-rail fence, swinging her legs back and forth. Sometimes I get scared too, she admitted quietly. Claire looked at her with surprise. You do? Emma nodded. After my mom went to heaven, I thought if Dad left for work every morning maybe he would never come home. Claire's expression softened. What helped? Emma smiled toward Caleb, who was adjusting a saddle blanket inside the barn. Dad never promised nothing bad would happen. He only promised he would always come back loving me. Claire looked down at the lemonade trembling slightly in her hand. Such simple words. Yet they carried more comfort than years of expensive counseling sessions she had quietly abandoned. Across the pasture, Storm slowly lifted his head and began walking toward the fence once more, not with urgency or expectation, but with the steady confidence of an old friend who had never stopped believing she would one day find the courage to forgive herself. The following morning arrived wrapped in soft amber light as thin ribbons of mist drifted across the pastures before slowly disappearing beneath the rising Texas sun. The ranch awakened without hurry. Meadowlarks called from weathered fence posts, the smell of fresh coffee floated through the open kitchen window, and somewhere inside the barn a horse gently nudged an empty feed bucket, creating a hollow metallic sound that echoed through the peaceful morning. Claire stood alone on the porch holding a warm mug between both hands, watching Caleb begin his day long before most executives in Dallas would even check their first email. He greeted every horse by name, filled each water trough carefully, and paused long enough to scratch an old bay gelding behind its ears before moving on to the next task. There was no audience. No cameras. No investors waiting to applaud his work. He simply believed living things deserved kindness whether anyone noticed or not. Emma skipped across the yard carrying a small basket filled with bright red apples. Dad says Storm likes these best, she said cheerfully. Claire smiled. Does he have favorites? Everybody does, Emma answered matter-of-factly. People just pretend they do not. Caleb walked over carrying a clean halter folded neatly across one arm. Today we are not riding, he said calmly. We are only learning to listen. Claire looked surprised. Listen. He nodded. Most people think horses learn from us. The truth is we usually learn from them first. He handed her a single apple. Walk in when you are ready. If you are not ready, we wait. There was no pressure in his voice, only quiet certainty. Claire took a slow breath before stepping through the open gate. The gravel gave way to soft earth beneath her boots. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, yet Storm remained perfectly still beneath the shade of the pecan tree. Caleb stayed several yards behind her, giving both woman and horse the space to discover each other without interruption. Claire extended the apple with an unsteady hand. Storm lifted his head, watching her carefully before taking one slow step forward. Then another. His powerful frame moved with surprising gentleness until his warm breath brushed across her fingertips. She froze. For one long second the old fear returned, whispering familiar lies she had believed for years. Caleb spoke softly from behind her. Do not think about what happened 12 years ago. Think about what is happening now. Claire swallowed hard but kept her hand steady. Storm carefully accepted the apple, his velvet muzzle barely touching her palm before he lowered his head again. Nothing terrible happened. No panic. No chaos. Only silence filled with birdsong and the quiet rustle of cottonwood leaves overhead. Emma clapped her hands once before remembering to stay quiet. See, she whispered with a grin. He remembers nice people. Claire laughed unexpectedly, a sound so unfamiliar that it surprised even her. Caleb noticed the change but said nothing. Instead, he picked up the old brush she had accepted the day before and placed it gently into her hands. Would you like to help? He asked. Claire hesitated only briefly before stepping beside Storm's shoulder. She slowly brushed along his glossy coat, each careful stroke releasing tiny clouds of dust that sparkled in the morning light. Storm closed his eyes with complete trust, standing so peacefully that Claire found herself breathing in the same slow rhythm. The ranch seemed to disappear around them. There were no board meetings waiting in New York, no attorneys expecting signatures, no reporters searching for headlines. There was only the quiet sound of the brush moving across warm muscle and the steady breathing of a horse that had never blamed her for the tragedy she carried every day. For the first time in 12 years, Claire realized the hardest heart she needed to earn forgiveness from had never belonged to Storm. It had always been her own. 3 peaceful days passed with a rhythm Claire had almost forgotten the world could still keep. Every sunrise arrived without conference calls. Every evening ended without contracts waiting for her signature. Instead, mornings began with the smell of fresh biscuits drifting from Caleb's farmhouse kitchen, the cheerful chatter of Emma packing feed into small buckets, and the familiar chorus of horses nickering softly as the first light spilled across Whitmore Ridge. Claire found herself waking earlier each day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to watch the ranch come alive. She slowly traded tailored business jackets for comfortable denim shirts borrowed from an old closet that had once belonged to her mother. Her expensive watch remained untouched on the bedroom dresser, replaced by dusty hands, wind-blown hair, and something she had not felt in years, unhurried time. Emma quickly decided that Claire belonged wherever adventures happened. By mid-morning they were gathering fresh eggs together, laughing as curious chickens wandered between their boots. Later they picked wildflowers along the creek while Emma explained which butterflies always returned during late spring. Claire listened carefully, realizing the little girl noticed details adults often ignored. Dad says flowers grow better when people stop rushing past them, Emma said as she carefully tied a bundle of bluebonnets together with twine. Claire smiled. Your father seems to know a lot about life. Emma giggled. He says horses taught him almost everything. Across the pasture Caleb was repairing an old split-rail fence with the same quiet concentration he brought to every task. Claire watched him for several moments before walking over carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He accepted one with a grateful nod. Thank you. They stood side by side without speaking. The breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh-cut grass while Storm grazed peacefully nearby. Finally Claire broke the silence. You are very different from the people I work with. Caleb smiled faintly. Is that good or bad? She looked toward the horizon before answering. I am still deciding. He laughed softly. Fair enough. A comfortable silence settled between them again. Claire realized she did not feel the need to impress him. He never asked about company profits, private planes, or magazine interviews. Instead he asked whether she had slept well, whether the horses seemed calmer that morning, and whether she wanted to learn how to braid a mane before sunset. Somehow those questions mattered more. That afternoon Caleb invited Claire to help saddle one of the older mares while Storm wandered freely nearby. She worked carefully beside him, occasionally making small mistakes that neither embarrassed nor frustrated her because Caleb never corrected her with criticism. He simply demonstrated once, then allowed her to discover the answer herself. "You teach differently," Claire observed. Caleb adjusted a leather strap before replying. "People remember confidence longer than instructions." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Who taught you that?" He paused for a moment. "My wife." Claire lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." Caleb's expression remained peaceful. "So am I. But grief does not disappear because we avoid talking about the people we love." His words settled gently into Claire's heart. They carried no bitterness. Only gratitude. Emma suddenly came running across the field holding a folded piece of paper. "Dad, look what I drew." She proudly opened a colorful crayon picture showing 3 people standing beside a large black horse beneath a bright yellow sun. Caleb smiled warmly. "That is beautiful." Emma pointed to each figure. "That is you. That is me. That is Claire." Then she pointed to Storm before grinning at Claire with complete innocence. "He looks happier now because everybody is together." Claire stared at the drawing longer than she expected. It was only a child's picture filled with uneven lines and oversized smiles. Yet something inside her quietly shifted. She had spent years building corporations that employed thousands of people, but somewhere along the way she had forgotten what it felt like to simply belong. As the evening sunlight painted the hills in shades of gold and amber, Storm slowly walked over and rested his head beside Claire's shoulder without hesitation, and for the first time since returning home, she no longer wondered whether the ranch was waiting to be sold. She quietly wondered whether it had been waiting for her all along. On the 7th morning the peaceful rhythm of the ranch changed before the sun had fully climbed above the eastern hills. Claire heard the distant sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway long before she reached the front porch. 3 black sport utility vehicles stopped neatly in front of the farmhouse, their polished paint reflecting the soft morning light in sharp contrast to the weathered barns surrounding them. Men and women dressed in tailored business suits stepped out carrying leather portfolios and tablet computers, speaking in calm professional voices that sounded strangely out of place beside the songs of meadowlarks and the gentle nickering of horses waiting for breakfast. Emma quietly peeked through the screen door before looking up at Caleb. "Your friends," she whispered hopefully. Caleb smiled gently. "I do not think so." Claire recognized every face immediately. Her chief financial officer. The company's general counsel. 2 members of the board. They had flown from New York before sunrise. She knew exactly why. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," her chief financial officer said as he approached with practiced confidence. "We apologize for arriving unannounced, but the board believes these documents require your immediate attention." Claire accepted the thick folder without opening it. She already knew what waited inside. The proposed sale agreement. Environmental studies. Purchase offers from developers. Financial projections showing. Record profits if Whitmore Ridge became a luxury resort community. Every number made perfect business sense. Every page quietly erased another piece of her family's history. Caleb carried 2 buckets of feed toward the paddock as though nothing unusual had happened. He greeted the visitors politely with a nod before continuing his work. He had spent enough years around horses to recognize when nervous energy only frightened everyone else. Claire appreciated that more than she could explain. The board members gathered beneath the old oak tree overlooking the ranch. "This property has become an underperforming asset," one director explained carefully. "The acquisition offer expires tomorrow afternoon. Shareholders are expecting your approval." Another added, "The development will create jobs, tourism, and significant long-term growth." Holding on to sentimental properties is not how successful companies remain successful. Claire looked across the rolling hills where Emma was brushing Storm beneath the warm morning sun while Caleb quietly repaired another section of fencing nearby. Neither of them attempted to interrupt. Neither listened to the conversation. They simply continued caring for the place everyone else seemed determined to measure only in dollars. "May I have a little time?" Claire asked quietly. "Of course," her attorney replied. "But we do need an answer before we return to Dallas this afternoon." She walked slowly toward the paddock where Caleb was fastening a new latch onto the gate. He glanced up and immediately understood from her expression that something important had changed. "You have to decide," he said softly. Claire nodded. "Everyone says selling this ranch is the responsible choice." Caleb tightened the final bolt before setting his wrench aside. "Maybe they are right." She looked surprised. "You think I should sell it?" He leaned comfortably against the fence, watching Storm graze nearby. "I think you should decide whether this place is property or home. Those are two very different things." Claire lowered her eyes. "If I keep it, people will say I made an emotional decision." Caleb smiled with quiet kindness. "The world has plenty of smart decisions. It is running short on wise ones." They stood together watching Emma laugh as Storm gently followed her around the pasture like an oversized family dog. Claire could almost imagine that scene lasting forever. But reality waited inside the folder resting beneath her arm. She finally looked at Caleb. "If I sign those papers today, this ranch will belong to someone else within 60 days. Caleb remained silent for several moments before speaking the words she would remember for the rest of her life. Sometimes saving something is not about owning it. Sometimes it is about remembering why it deserved to be saved in the first place. Claire looked down at the unsigned contract in her hands, and for the first time since becoming the youngest chief executive officer in her company's history, she realized that the hardest decision she had ever faced could never be solved by numbers alone. Claire stood alone beneath the old oak tree as the black sport utility vehicles disappeared beyond the front gate, leaving only a ribbon of dust floating across the quiet ranch road. The unsigned contracts remained inside the leather folder resting against her side, yet they suddenly felt strangely distant compared to the steady rhythm of hoofbeats drifting from the pasture. The afternoon sun had softened into a warm golden glow, stretching long shadows across the rolling hills while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, leather, and fresh hay. Emma skipped toward the barn with a smile that seemed untouched by the complicated decisions adults created for themselves. Caleb watched her disappear inside before turning toward Claire. "Come with me," he said simply. She followed without asking where they were going. They stopped beside the old tack room where a worn leather saddle rested across a wooden stand, polished by decades of careful hands rather than expensive products. Caleb lifted it gently, brushing away a thin layer of dust before carrying it toward Storm, who stood waiting quietly beside the fence as though he had sensed this moment long before either of them had. Claire's breathing slowed the instant she saw the saddle. 12 years earlier it had belonged to her father. She recognized every stitched detail, every faded mark along the leather, every small imperfection created by countless miles together. She instinctively stepped backward. Caleb noticed but did not move closer. "You do not have to do this," he said calmly. "Not for me. Not for anyone." Claire looked at Storm, then at the saddle, before quietly answering, "I am tired of letting one day decide every day that came after it." Caleb nodded once. "Then let today become a different memory." He carefully secured the saddle across Storm's back while speaking softly to the horse, his voice almost blending into the gentle rustling leaves overhead. Storm remained perfectly still, lowering his head as though honoring something larger than simple training. Emma appeared beside the fence holding a small braided rein she had cleaned that morning. She smiled at Claire without saying a word, quietly placing the rein into her hands before stepping back again. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it. Caleb walked beside her until they stood near Storm's shoulder. He extended one hand toward her, steady and patient, exactly as he had on the first day they met. "Trust yourself," he said quietly. "The horse already does." Claire looked into his eyes before placing her hand in his. Warm, steady, reassuring. Together they walked beside Storm across the pasture until they reached the old riding trail overlooking the creek. Caleb positioned himself beside the mounting block but never rushed her. Claire rested one hand against the saddle, closed her eyes, and took one slow breath after another. The memories returned, but this time they no longer arrived alone. They were joined by Emma's laughter, Caleb's quiet kindness, the peaceful mornings, and every small moment that had reminded her life could still grow beyond sorrow. She opened her eyes and slowly placed one boot into the stirrup. Caleb remained beside her without touching her unless she needed him. With calm determination she eased herself into the saddle. Storm did not move. He simply waited until she settled comfortably, his ears gently turning toward the sound of her breathing. Claire's eyes filled with tears, not from fear but from relief. Caleb looked up and smiled. Whenever you are ready. She gathered the reins gently. Storm took one careful step. Then another. The old trail unfolded beneath them exactly as it had years ago, yet everything felt different. The breeze carried away something she had held inside for far too long. As Storm continued walking through the golden afternoon light, Claire realized she was no longer riding away from the past. She was finally riding toward her future. The ride ended just before sunset, not because Storm had grown tired, but because Claire had reached a place inside herself she had not believed still existed. She slowly slid from the saddle, her boots touching the familiar Texas soil with a quiet confidence that had been missing for 12 long years. Emma ran toward her with bright eyes, wrapping both arms around Claire without hesitation. "I knew you could do it," she said proudly. Claire laughed through grateful tears and gently hugged the little girl back. Caleb quietly removed the saddle from Storm before leading him toward the barn, giving Claire the privacy to absorb what had just happened. The evening settled gently across the ranch as crickets began their familiar chorus and golden light softened into deep shades of amber and rose. Claire wandered alone toward the old farmhouse, drawn by memories she could no longer avoid. Inside her father's study, everything remained almost exactly as she remembered. Shelves filled with well-worn books lined the walls. A faded map of the ranch still hung beside the stone fireplace. Dust floated peacefully through narrow beams of sunlight slipping between the curtains. She slowly traced her fingers across the old oak desk where her father had spent countless evenings writing letters, reviewing ranch records, and planning tomorrow's work. As she opened the top drawer, something caught her attention. Resting beneath a leather journal was a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in unmistakable handwriting. Claire Whitmore. Her heart began beating faster. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained perfectly clear. Her hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the letter. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then life has carried you farther than either of us imagined. I hope you never measure yourself by the hardest day you have ever lived. If anything ever happens to me, I need you to know something your heart may refuse to believe. My doctor has already warned me that my heart is not as strong as it once was. I have chosen not to tell you because I wanted your childhood filled with hope instead of worry. If my journey ends sooner than expected, it will never be because of you. It will never be because of Storm. It will never be because of one beautiful morning we chose to spend together. That ride would always have been worth it because every moment with you has been the greatest blessing of my life." Claire covered her mouth as tears quietly rolled down her face. Every sentence dissolved another layer of guilt she had carried alone for more than a decade. She continued reading through blurred eyes. "Storm has always trusted people who lead with kindness instead of fear. He will wait for you as long as necessary because that is who he is. I only hope that one day you will offer yourself the same patience you offer everyone else. Do not spend your future apologizing for something that was never your fault. Live bravely. Love generously. And when the time comes, let this ranch become a place where broken hearts remember how to heal." Claire slowly lowered the letter against her chest. Outside the open window she could hear Storm quietly nickering in the barn while Emma's laughter floated through the evening air alongside Caleb's calm voice. None of them knew what she had just discovered, yet somehow they had already begun fulfilling the final wish written by the man she had loved most. For the first time since losing her father, Claire looked toward the fading sunset without asking why the past had happened. Instead, she found herself thanking it for leading her home. 6 months later, Whitmore Ridge looked different without losing the quiet spirit that had always made it feel like home. Fresh white fences stretched across the rolling hills beside restored barns whose weathered wood had been carefully preserved instead of replaced. New signs welcomed veterans, grieving families, children overcoming fear, and anyone searching for a place where healing could begin one small step at a time. Claire had rejected every development proposal. The board had argued. Financial analysts had questioned her decision. Shareholders had demanded explanations. She listened respectfully to each concern before presenting a new vision that surprised everyone. Whitmore Ridge would become a non-profit equine therapy center supported by the Whitmore Foundation, proving that success could be measured not only by quarterly earnings but also by restored lives. Newspapers called it an unexpected business decision. Claire quietly called it coming home. Caleb never asked for recognition. He continued waking before sunrise, feeding horses, repairing fences, and teaching visitors the same lesson he had offered Claire on her first day. Trust could never be forced. It had to be earned with patience. Emma proudly became the unofficial tour guide, introducing every horse as though they were lifelong neighbors. She remembered every visitor's name and somehow convinced even the shyest children to smile before they left. Storm became the gentle heart of the ranch. The stallion, once known only for his untamed spirit, now carried first-time riders with remarkable calm, as though he understood exactly why they had come. One cool autumn afternoon, Claire stood beside the arena watching a young boy complete his first confident ride while his mother quietly wiped grateful tears from her cheeks. Caleb joined her at the fence, slipping his hands into the pockets of his faded denim jacket. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. Claire looked across the fields glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. "I used to think I had to protect his legacy," she replied. "Now I realize he only wanted his legacy to protect others." Caleb smiled, saying nothing more. They had long ago discovered that the most important conversations often ended in comfortable silence. As evening settled over the ranch, Emma came running across the grass carrying another colorful drawing. This time the picture showed a large farmhouse, Storm standing beneath the old oak tree, and 3 smiling people holding hands while the sun disappeared behind the hills. She looked up at Claire with complete sincerity. "Can I ask you something?" Claire knelt beside her. "Anything." Emma hesitated for only a moment. "Can we stop calling you Miss Claire?" Claire felt her heart catch. "What would you like to call me?" Emma glanced at Caleb before looking back with hopeful eyes. "Can we finally call you family?" For a long second no one spoke. The breeze stirred gently through the oak leaves while Storm wandered over, stopping quietly beside them as though he had been waiting for this moment too. Claire wrapped her arms around Emma before looking up at Caleb. His eyes reflected the same quiet warmth that had first welcomed her through the ranch gate months earlier. He reached for her hand, not to rescue her, not to lead her, but simply to walk beside her. This time she did not hesitate. She intertwined her fingers with his as the last golden light settled across Whitmore Ridge. Some people spend their lives searching for miracles in distant places, believing they arrive with great noise or impossible signs. Yet the greatest miracles often begin with a patient heart, an open hand, a faithful horse, and the quiet courage to trust again. As the first evening stars appeared above the Texas sky, the ranch breathed peacefully around them, and the silence no longer carried sorrow. It carried dignity, grace, second chances, and the gentle promise that love, when built upon kindness instead of fear, always finds its way home. Thanks for spending your time with us today. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. And I'm curious, how old are you, and did this story feel relatable to you? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.